3.3 Stress, Anxiety and Arousal. In this presentation, I will be analysing stress, anxiety and arousal in sport. I will apply these three aspects of psychology to two individual scenarios. The first scenario is Nick. The number 2 seed in college, Nick has been struggling to play well all season. The new coach has tried to reassure him and say how good he is and how well he should be doing for the college. They've been giving extra coaching time and have developed his game plan with new and innovative strategies. Nick is feeling nauseous before games and never seems to be able to apply the tactic in the games. He struggles to play the more precise and accurate shots, and if he makes an error, his performance falls apart. Incidentally, he is an A-grade student, but constantly worries about his grades and spends hours doing homework. The second scenario is Sarah, the goal shooter in the netball squad. She just seems to fail. 32% scoring average in league games against Lewis and Varney, yet in training sessions and other local games, her scoring average is 86%. Colleges often schedule these crunch games to the end of the season, when many spectators can watch. Interestingly, some of the other players in Sarah's team, such as the centre, Rachel, have not been very supportive and don't understand Sarah's poor performance in the crunch games of the league. Sarah is aware of Rachel's attitude to her. Rachel just seems to thrive on the atmosphere and challenge of the tough games and has received Player of the Game several times. One definition of stress is a pattern of negative physiological states and psychological responses occurring in situations where people perceive threats to their well-being, which they may be unable to meet. This was written by Lazarus and Folkman in 1984. The phrase, which they may be unable to meet, is especially significant when applied to sport, as this could suggest that stress in sport comes from a feeling of not being able to cope with certain situational demands. This can be applied to Sarah. She only has a scoring average of 32% in league games against Lewis and Varndine, whereas in training games her average is 86%. This suggests that she is stressed during the higher pressure games and would serve as an example of Lazarus's definition. She is unable to cope with the pressure with the demands of her situation. There are two different types of stress within sport: eustress, which is positive stress, and distress, which is negative. Everyone's level of optimal stress is different, and so there is no certain point at which eustress becomes distress. Eustress is where the athlete uses the stress of their situation to motivate themselves and improve their performance. As graph number 1 shows, eustress allows the performer to reach their optimal level of performance. An example of this in one of the scenarios would be Rachel, who is said to thrive on the atmosphere and challenge of the big games, and has received Player of the Game many times in these games. Rachel clearly has a higher optimum stress level than Sarah, as during the big game she experiences eustress, whereas Sarah experiences distress. Distress is the opposite to eustress and has a negative impact on performance. Distress is an extreme form of anxiety and can affect performance by leading to a lack of concentration or over-concentration, in which the performer is so concerned with their performance that they disregard tactics and skill and focus entirely on their own performance. This is sometimes known as trying too hard. This can be applied to Nick, as he often feels nauseous before performances due to worrying. This then affects his level of performance, which can fall apart. There are many factors which can cause stress in an individual. The majority of these come from the environment of the performance, but other factors may include competition, personal life, and lifestyle factors. The environment can cause stress in most performers, as the pressure from audiences/fans, as well as coaches and teammates, is much higher in big games when the result matters more. Factors from a performer's personal life can also have an impact. For example, if a performer is going through a breakup or divorce, or a family feud, then this can have an effect on their performance. They may lose concentration. An example of one of these external factors for stress for Nick could be the fact that he is constantly concerned with his grades at school. The stress process is how stress is used positively or negatively. Stage 1 is the initial demand that the performer must meet. Stage 2 is where the performer determines whether the stress is a challenge or a threat. If the demand is perceived as a challenge, then the stress is eustress in Stage 3 and is used to motivate the performer in Stage 4. If, however, the demand is perceived as a threat, then the stress becomes distress and has a negative impact on performance. There are numerous symptoms of stress. These come in the form of somatic symptoms, cognitive symptoms, and behavioral symptoms. Somatic effects of stress involve blood being diverted to the muscles, muscle tension increasing, heart rate increasing, and breathing rate increasing. This makes our body tense and so has an effect on performance. Stress also induces cognitive symptoms in a performer, such as reduced concentration, inability to make decisions, frequent mistakes, and narrowed attention field. These can obviously negatively impact performance, whereas somatic symptoms of stress tend to improve performance. Although stress can also have behavioural symptoms, such as talking quickly and fidgeting, these are less applicable to sport. These symptoms are evident in Nick's case, as a narrowed field of attention and loss of concentration is possibly what prevents him from making precise, accurate shots when he is nervous. Anxiety is different to stress. Anxiety can be defined as a negative state of worry, apprehension, or tension that often occurs in the absence of real or obvious danger. Typically, the tension felt by anxious individuals is accompanied by a heightened state of physiological arousal. This was a definition provided by Buckwork and Dishman in 2002. This can be applied to both scenarios, as both Sarah and Nick get anxious prior to their performances. When they are in no danger, they are simply going to be playing their respective sports. Anxiety can be presented in a physiological form or somatic anxiety. These tend to be similar symptoms to arousal, but are triggered by cognitive anxiety. These symptoms include increased heart rate and changes in blood pressure. Cognitive anxiety is the mental aspect of anxiety and is made up of worry and fear of negative evaluations of performance. This triggers the somatic symptoms of anxiety, but also cognitive symptoms such as loss of concentration and negative thoughts. Cognitive anxiety will have affected both Sarah and Nick. Sarah's cognitive anxiety would have come from a fear of playing badly in front of a large crowd. Nick's would have come from fear of poor performance, especially as he is told that he is expected to perform well. Trait anxiety is a personality disposition that is stable over time. This means that an athlete who is naturally anxious will always be anxious before playing sport, as it is innate. Someone who is naturally anxious will react easily and become highly aroused quickly. State anxiety refers to how anxious somebody is at a precise moment. If an athlete is not normally an anxious person but feels nervous before a big game or important performance, then this is an example of state anxiety. For example, Nick suffers from trait anxiety as it is part of his personality, whereas Sarah only suffers from state anxiety as she only experiences anxiety before certain games. Competitive anxiety is a form of state anxiety. This applies to performers who perceive competition as potentially threatening. Anxiety is caused by a combination of both personal and situational factors. Personal factors include trait anxiety, self-esteem, and social physique anxiety. Situational factors may include importance of the event or uncertainty before or during the event. This would help to understand Sarah's anxiety before big games, as they are deemed as more important, so this becomes a situational factor. There are different methods of measuring levels of anxiety in performers. The first method is the SCAT test, devised by Martins in 1977. This is a self-report that focuses on four factors: individual differences in how performers interact with different situations, different types of anxiety experience, state or trait, specific traits displayed only in competitive anxiety, and the competition itself. Another method of measuring anxiety is the CSAI2 test. This uses self-report to measure cognitive state anxiety, somatic state anxiety, and self-confidence. Two general patterns emerge from these two tests, indicating that cognitive anxiety increases in the build-up to competition and fluctuates during competition based on success, and that somatic anxiety remains low until a dramatic rise a few hours before an event and decreases slowly during the event. This is evident in Nick's scenario. He begins to feel nauseous before games, which is a somatic symptom of anxiety. Arousal is a general physiological and psychological activation varying on a continuum from deep sleep to intense excitement. This was a definition of arousal given by Weinberg and Gold in 2007. Rachel is an obvious example of arousal, as she seems to thrive on the atmosphere. This shows that Rachel's peak arousal is much higher than Sarah's. The RAS plays a key role in arousal. This is a part of the brain that monitors stimulation and regulates arousal accordingly. For example, in an introvert, the RAS may be oversensitive. meaning that they require less arousal to be stimulated. Whereas in an extrovert, the RAS may be undersensitive, meaning the person requires more stimulation from their environment and lifestyle. Arousal levels are different for every individual. Different athletes have different optimal levels of arousal. As graph 1 shows, some athletes only require very little arousal to bring out their best performance, whereas other athletes require very high levels of arousal to perform at their best. Rachel evidently has a high optimum arousal in comparison with Sarah, who requires little arousal to perform well. Somatic anxiety can lead to an increased arousal as the body is prepared for fight or flight, and this can lead to a better physical performance. However, cognitive anxiety affects how the somatic symptoms are put to use. In Rachel's case, due to her cognitive anxiety being converted to eustress, her fight or flight system chooses fight, whereas in Nick and Sarah's cases, their bodies choose flight. There are many ways in which we can attempt to explain arousal. The first of these theories is the drive theory, Hull, 1951. As graph 2 shows, this is one of the earliest explanations of arousal and promotes a linear relationship between arousal and performance. A sporting application of this could be Rachel, whose performance is optimal in the high-pressure games, suggesting that her performance has a positive correlation with arousal levels. Zajonc developed this theory in 1965 and stated that the presence of others brings out a dominant response, and this determines the most likely way a performer will perform a skill or task. Evaluations of the drive theory, however, are that it is inaccurate for inexperienced performers and assumes that low levels of arousal will automatically mean poor performance. This is clearly not true, as Sarah performs at her best when at low levels of arousal. The, the next theory of arousal is the inverted U theory, as shown in graph 3. This explains that as arousal increases, as does performance, until an optimal point. If arousal increases beyond this point, then performance gradually decreases. Sarah's optimum arousal is low, so when arousal is too high, such as in the big games at the end of the season that attract large crowds, her performance begins to drop off. A positive evaluation of the inverted U theory is that it is widely accepted that performance is decreased when under or over aroused. However, a negative evaluation is that performance does not always gradually get worse when someone is over-aroused. This is shown clearly by Sarah, whose scoring average in no-pressure games is 86% compared to just 32% in high-pressure games. This is quite a drastic fall-off. A theory that combats this evaluation is the catastrophe theory. Fazey and Hardy in 1988 stated that when cognitive arousal was low but somatic arousal was high, then performance levels followed the inverted U model. However, they also stated that when cognitive arousal was also high, the deterioration in performance when arousal rose above optimum level was much faster. They found that to restore performance level, the performer must calm down and reduce arousal levels to back below optimal. Arousal levels can also impact attention. Nidefa in 1976 found that when under-aroused, a performer's attention range was too wide, leading to mistakes, and when over-aroused, the performer's attention span was too narrow. There has been previous research to support the catastrophe theory, but testing it is difficult and it can't be used to help predict performance. The last theory for arousal is the eyes-off theory, or independent zones of function, as shown in graph 5. This states that athletes' best zones of function are individual and that different athletes all work optimally at different zones of arousal. Hannon, the researcher behind eyes-off, also found that for elite athletes, their optimal zone was at low arousal, whereas for others the optimal zone tended to be higher. This theory states that an athlete's optimal level is a band or zone rather than a specific point. An athlete like Rachel's band would be higher on a scale of arousal than Sarah's. Athletes can use both somatic and cognitive techniques to control stress, anxiety, and anxiousness. Cognitive techniques include imagery, such as forming mental pictures or scenarios of positivity. An individual can also use the techniques of thought stopping or self-talk. Thought stopping is recognizing negative thoughts and blocking them out. and self talk is maintaining a positive internal monologue.